Hey, it's working.
There we go. Right, I'll do a small introduction. Hello and welcome to everyone watching, when you're watching. I'm here with the, I'll say incredible, Tom Kalinske.
Oh, thank you.
So, what I'll start off with is, what did you think of Console Wars?
Well, it's. I thought it was actually very well written, and I think the story was well told. I was surprised it took as many pages as it did to tell the story, but I'm grateful for all the research that Blake did. He talked with over 200 people to put the story together, so quite a bit of interviewing.
I must say it did impress me a lot reading through it. There was a lot of stuff that not just I hadn't known before, but I believe a lot of stuff that hadn't actually been made publicly available before. A lot of knowledge that people hadn't heard, such as the John Madden football game being essentially reworked to create.
For Joe Montana football.
Joe Montana,
right.
that was it.
Right.
Yeah, I kind of feel like the depth that he went into really impressed me. I'm kind of upset there wasn't more, to be honest, and it ended when it did. What was your time like at Sega?
Well, it was real. It was a great time for me. I mean, I had first of all, I made a lot of good friends there. I had a wonderful team of people that I worked with. And so I would say 90% of my experience at Sega was very positive. It was only when, toward the end of my time there, when I felt like I wasn't able to either make the decision or I wasn't able to influence the Japan board and chairman to make the correct decisions that I became uncomfortable with my time at Sega. But up till then, I thought it was a wonderful experience.
Fantastic. I must say that's really what kind of got me, because when you think about it, in terms of Sega leaving the hardware business, it kind of feels like it's because the initial struggles between SOA and SOJ eventually got to the point where SOJ sort of, after the kind of failure, if you will, of the Saturn, they were not entirely sure what to do with their next generation console, and it kind of feels like they were maybe a bit out of touch with their American audience.
Yes.
And without listening so much to SOA and going with what they believed was right for the American audience, maybe they didn't know best and sort of dug themselves in a bit of a hole.
Well, that's why I was pretty surprised, because frankly, I mean, if you think about where we are today in the video game business, if I had been able to convince Nakayama-san and the board in Japan to do the deal that I had on the table with Sony for us together to do a Sony-Sega hardware platform, and we would share the cost of development of that platform and share the probable loss, because generally we were losing money, certainly for the first few years at least, on hardware. But each company benefited from the software that they did and the revenue and the profit they made from that software. To me, that was a no-brainer deal. I mean, we should have done that because we were a lot better at doing software in those days. So initially, certainly, we would have benefited more than Sony did. And also, think about history today. If there'd been a Sega-Sony platform that went forward through time, Sega would still be a powerhouse in both hardware and software.
Well, I mean, we could be seeing the Sega PlayStation 4, who knows?
Right. Or the Sony Sega PlayStation 4.
Yeah, it's very interesting how things like that, it's one tiny little deal that fell through, and it's entirely changed the industry. And not to mention, I think Sega leaving the hardware industry is probably one of the things that prompted Microsoft to try and sort of take their place.
Yes.
One thing I found very interesting, and I'm not sure whether you'll know too much about this, while you were still at Sega, development began on a game called Sonic 3D Blast. And one thing I found odd was that in early 1997 it released for Windows PC. Do you know possibly why that may have been? Because I feel like before they were a third-party publisher, it seems odd to release one of, well, your big franchise on what could be considered a competing platform.
Right. Well, about the time I was leaving, conversations with Microsoft had begun. And so that was another deal that I wasn't involved in that one, so I don't know the details of it, but I know the conversations were occurring, and Microsoft and Sega were trying to figure out a way of working together. And at the same time, the chairman of CSK Corporation, who owned 40% of the Sega stock, had pushed Nakayama-san to start a Sega PC division. And so they did. And the initial intent was not to do Sonic-like games on the PC, but rather to do original creations. And there were 3 or 4 that I was aware of that were under development, and they were fairly large budget PC games. And so I too was surprised when all of a sudden Sonic ends up on the PC. I was gone by then, so I didn't really dwell on it too long. But yes, that was a surprise.
At any point, do you ever feel any sort of regret for leaving Sega when you did, or do you still believe that was the right time for you to depart?
Well, I think it was the right time for me to depart. And also, one of the things that I don't think got touched on in the book too much was we had launched the Pico system in the U.S., and we achieved about 100 million in sales on it, and it was successful. It was not a large profit maker, but it was a successful education platform. And that experience showed me the power of combining video game play with education and making education content more fun and interesting for kids. And so, I was now by 96, I was dissatisfied with my role as CEO of Sega, because clearly some decisions had been overruled or not made in the right way. And I got this offer from Mr. Milken and Mr. Ellison to create a new company that used education technology to improve education. And I was highly interested in that. So I think it was the right time for me to leave.
Absolutely. I mean, I heavily agree based on the fact that I didn't realise until after I had read the book and I did a little more research how involved you were in the creation of LeapFrog.
Right.
Because I myself at a young age and my younger siblings all had various LeapFrog books, and I didn't realise the sort of connection, in a way, to video games that it had. Other than I do believe I remember a Sonic LeapFrog.
Yes, I did do. I couldn't resist. I did a deal with Sega on Sonic on the Leapster handheld education game machine. And you might also, if you take a look at the Leapster, I'm sure you'll notice it looks a heck of a lot like Game Gear, except the colors are green, the buttons are in the same place. And that's sort of another funny story. When I was at LeapFrog as CEO, and we had the original LeapPad business, and we didn't have a handheld business. And one day I have several Leapsters here at home, and I grabbed a Leapster, and I took it to LeapFrog offices, and I handed it to the head of R&D, and I said, "Here, let's make this, and we'll do educational software on it." Well, he took me literally, as engineers often do, and he certainly did make this. And so the Leapster looks almost exactly like a Game Gear.
In fact, speaking of the Game Gear, following the Game Gear was the Sega Nomad, which was only released in North America. Is there a reason it didn't make it internationally?
Well, I think the Nomad played 16-bit cartridges, so all of your Genesis cartridges would work on it. And I still have one of those here as well. And I liked it a lot. The problem with it was it really ate up batteries quickly. I mean, the battery life was just awful. And if we'd been able to overcome that, I think it could have been a very interesting handheld device for the marketplace. But it just the life wasn't, the battery life wasn't what it should have been.
That's understandable, and surprisingly, handhelds now still suffer quite a battery issue at the moment. I've been trying to get hold of a Nomad for quite a while, and unfortunately, because of the fact it was only released in the US, it becomes all the more difficult. But I'll get one eventually.
Yeah.
Still,
well, you should try. I won't sell you. I only have one, so I can't give you mine. But you might try online and see if there's anybody that's anxious to sell it or not.
Yeah, I'll have to have a look about it. There's bound to be one probably on eBay or something. But
eBay, I would think, yeah.
Yeah, one thing I always admired about Sega, a little bit over Nintendo, is I think they were very ahead of their time with ideas. For instance, as stated in the book, Sega was already working on virtual reality, which has only recently become quite a big thing in the world of gaming. And I find it interesting that in the 80s that was already being worked on and developed on.
I could tell you one funny virtual reality story.
Absolutely, I'd love to hear it.
So I think one of the fathers of virtual reality was a man named Jason Lanier, who lives here in Silicon Valley. And Jason was also, he was a genius, but he was also a musician. He could play many different musical instruments. And anyway, so we're working on virtual reality, and we needed to get this guy's input because he was the genius in it. And so there was a meeting set up at his home because he didn't have an office. And he was a very unusual looking guy, had long dreadnoughts. I mean, he's Scandinavian, I think, by background, but he had this long blonde dreadnought hair, all looked like knots. And he forgot we had the meeting, and we're knocking on the door, and we hear the music playing, and we hear like a flute and other instruments being played. And so we had to knock louder, and all of a sudden he throws the door open. He's stark naked. So here's this guy, stark naked with long dreadnoughts. I'd never met him before, and he's got a flute in one hand, and this was the fellow we're going to work with on virtual reality. So that was my introduction to this genius who really was an early pioneer in virtual reality.
Wow. it does amaze me, some of the bizarre stories
just crazy
that come out of things like this. In fact, one thing that I wasn't sure whether to mention, I found it a bit funny. I saw on TV one of the animation cartoons of Sonic. I think it was the Sonic X anime. And the human character in the anime had a butler called Mr. Naka, which I think may have been a joke on Yuji Naka when I was.
Yes, of course it was. Yes.
Which I didn't realise at the time of watching it. One thing I'm very interested to know: what are your thoughts on, assuming you've seen, the new redesigns of Sonic and the team?
Well, you know, it's always kind of surprising when you see a redesign that's done with new 3D animation techniques. And so I was sort of taken aback by it because I was so used to the Sonic that I grew up with and loved. And I think initially I had kind of a negative reaction to it, but it's sort of growing on me now. I mean, I've seen enough of it now to where I'm kind of getting used to it. Not so sure about all the other characters and how they look, but I think Sonic is coming around in my mind. I know I had the same reaction when I first saw Mickey Mouse done in with modern 3D computer graphics. I thought initially it was just, wow, it just doesn't look right. But after a while, it settles down and it looks okay.
I think I agree on that. That was kind of the only character I'm still not sure about is Knuckles. I was been very, very beefed up.
That's different.
Although I did.
And then there's that new character. What's the new one? Sticks or Twigs or something?
I think it is something like that. Yeah. One thing I did find interesting. I saw an interview with one of the redesigners, and they were saying that they originally were far more different. It was a much more different redesign, and it was due to various people's reactions that they made it look a little more similar to the original. One thing I also wondered, I don't know if this was just something that happened over time or whether there was a lot of discussion about this. Sonic kind of had a little change in design, moving on from Sonic 3, where he became a little bit taller, a darker shade of blue. Was there a reasoning behind that?
I believe there was, and I'm trying to remember what it was. I think we were trying to make it more appealing to a slightly older audience.
Right.
And I think that was the rationale on that one.
That makes sense, because I'd never really noticed, because I'd grown up with Sonic, but I never really sort of compared and looked back until Sonic Generations came out recently.
Yeah.
And you had in the same game the two Sonics.
Then you could see it clearly.
Absolutely. And how do I word this? Do you remember at all the process of a game called Sonic Extreme? It's one of the big sort of mysteries around cancelled Sonic games. And I wondered if you might be able to shed a little light on why that may have been cancelled.
I know about it, but I'm trying to remember the rationale for that. I'll have to ask around and get back to you on that one.
No problem. What is it, do you think, mainly about the Saturn that may not have particularly caught on with audiences? Because I actually remember that was my only home console until I got my own, the Saturn, and my favourite game, I don't know if you remember, was called Bug, which was a 3D platformer, as is obvious about a bug. Hilarious game, but nonetheless, I'm steering off. What do you think it may have been that it may not have helped the Saturn in gaining a strong audience?
Well, a couple of things. Joe Miller and I felt that the machine that we were going to bring out after Genesis had to have a big step up in power and in terms of graphics and in terms of sound. And I don't think Saturn was quite enough. And then the other thing was, I think the software that was done initially, too much of it was on what I would call on rails, where you couldn't explore the whole world. You were kind of stuck in certain areas, and I think that got to be boring for players. And I think those were the main reasons. I mean, it all comes down to how good is the game, how good is the software, and I don't think it was quite. The initial titles weren't quite good enough, and it would have helped if the machine had been a little bit more powerful. Which is why I wanted to do the Sony Sega platform, the combination platform.
Was there a time where you started considering a Sonic 4, a proper sequel? Because we recently got Sonic 4 in 2 episodes on mobile platforms, but I don't really count them as a Sonic 4. Were there talks in creating a 4 for the Sega Saturn?
Not while I was not while I was involved. Again, I left in '96, so there might have been afterward.
Yeah. What would be your opinion of Nintendo now? Because as a company, I personally feel they've changed, not maybe out of choice, more the industry has changed and has forced them to change. Of course, they no longer have the power over third-party developers as they used to. They can't quite impose all the rules they do. And, so what sort of do you feel about them now?
Well, I think they have changed a bit. They obviously are still... they have their strategy, and they really stick to it, and they're not too heavily influenced by the outside world, But it's kind of interesting because I have talked a little bit with, or I've had some communication, should I say, with Howard Lincoln over the years. And I think that while at the time he really didn't like what we were doing at Sega and really felt it was wrong, I think over time he recognized that things like the formation of the video game rating system, which he violently opposed initially. He didn't want that at all because he felt that it wasn't necessary because Nintendo didn't make games that needed to be rated, in his opinion. But after it was done, he realized that this benefited the industry because now the industry was able to maintain an audience up to older ages and to build an older audience that they wouldn't have been able to do without having something like a rating system. He didn't want to do E3 initially, and later when he saw how we were doing our private shows with other third parties at Sega, and that kind of grew into to E3, he realized that was the right thing to do. So there are a lot of things that we did at Sega that I think later helped change Nintendo for the better. I think he would admit that. Nintendo today, I like the fact that they did the Wii because it got a different kind of play dynamic into video games. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I know it's not selling as well as you'd want it to now, but it still was quite a step, a different step. And so I thought that was a good strategic move for them. And anyway, so they're still doing fine, and they're certainly a difficult competitor.
I must say, I think Nintendo chose the right path after the GameCube, where they sort of realised that maybe the Power War isn't where they should head, because I think when you look at the console wars now, you're looking more at Sony and Microsoft, and I feel like Nintendo are sort of a little bit outside of that. I feel like unintentionally they've become sort of like the secondary console, if you will. So people will have either a PlayStation 4 or an Xbox One perhaps next to their Wii or Wii U, because they sort of went for the family audience. They tried to appeal to people who weren't necessarily gamers, which I feel is the problem they had with the Wii U, in that they tried to get back to that audience. But obviously, a lot of the audience they were aiming for care a lot about the specification of their machine and pretty graphics and things like that, which is something they hadn't quite excelled at.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good analysis of it.
Do you think Sega could ever re-enter the console industry?
Oh boy, they're part of Sammy now, and Sammy's a large and diverse entertainment company, and it certainly has a lot of resources. So, I'd never say never. I mean, if they came up with a breakthrough virtual reality type of game experience that really was fun to do, maybe they'd have the courage to re-enter the hardware business. But my fear is that with the current management, they probably wouldn't. I think they're happier just doing software.
It is a shame. A lot of my friends agree with me that when I suggest the possibility of possibly like a Dreamcast 2, if you will, everyone loves the idea of it, because no one ever disliked Sega, ever. I mean, everyone has always loved Sega products, and I think it was a very unfortunate turn of events that they happened to leave the hardware industry. How do you feel when you see, for instance, a trailer for Sonic Boom exclusively on Nintendo Wii U and 3DS? How do you feel when you see that, and obviously you see things like Sonic in Super Smash Brothers and Sonic and Mario at the Olympic Games and things like that?
Yeah. Well, frankly, it blows my mind. I was at E3, and I'm happy I played against one of the demonstrators, and I was Sonic and she was Mario, and I did beat her. But it just blows my mind that it's, and particularly this preference for Nintendo. I don't understand why if they were going to do it, why didn't they do it on all platforms? Why is it only on Nintendo Wii U? The Sonic Boom. I mean, the others, anyway.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that because the past three games, Sonic Lost World, Sonic and Mario at the Winter Olympics, and now Sonic Boom are all part of a Nintendo deal for 3 exclusive games. And I find it interesting because I can't imagine being in that mindset of anyone who worked at either Sega or Nintendo back then. Never could have thought of this as a possibility. Because they were absolute rivals. Of course, you were either a Sonic guy or you were a Mario guy. And to think that eventually one day you might be buying games titled Sonic and Mario. It
blows my mind too.
Yeah, it's and one thing I think is a shame about the industry now, I don't think you get mascots in quite the way you used to back then. While Nintendo still has Super Mario, Sony and Microsoft don't really have their one mascot, which I think is a shame. I like the idea of having a mascot to front everything and have that sort of rivalry.
Right. It is interesting that neither Sony or Microsoft developed their own character that they could build into a brand. And that is something that I would have thought they both would have at least attempted to do.
Yeah. Pardon me. As you can see, obviously, the gaming industry is a whole different realm to what it was back then. How do you feel about, because it's quite a controversial topic nowadays, how do you feel about violence in video games? Because obviously it was a big deal when Mortal Kombat first came out, and if you look at more recent Mortal Kombat titles, how obviously it gets more realistic as time goes by. What do you think about them now? Do you think they're still acceptable within the industry?
I do. I mean, because, also look at the industry and how it's changed. I mean, when I started in the video game industry, the whole market was only it was a couple $1 billion worldwide. And today it's $63 billion. And it's bigger than the movie business. And the average age, I understand, I read somewhere, the average age of a Sony PlayStation 4 is 35. So that means there's a lot of 40-year-olds as well as a lot of 15-year-olds playing games on these systems. So, of course, you have to do no different than the movie business. You have to have movies for different mature audiences, and you have to have different types of storylines that appeal to older audiences. And I don't see video games as any different than that. I really still, and also, by the way, it's still a relatively small part of the total business. I mean, the total business still is probably 90% games without a lot of violence, or maybe 80% of games without a lot of violence in it. So it's not like every single video game is violent. And I think it's, our politicians over here like to blame video games for any violent act that a young male does. And they say, see, he was a video game player. Well, yeah, because 95% of young men are video game players. It's sort of like saying, gee, he drank water. It's water's fault,
I absolutely agree. Every time I see a news story saying that, I'm always saying, well, chances are he probably also watched Friends on TV a lot.
Right, or the BBC.
Yeah, maybe he watched the news every night. Now we're going to blame the news for what they did. And I kind of feel like, and I don't know if you would agree, I feel like it's because a lot of people in the world still don't, and this is mostly people who, let's say, didn't really grow up with it, still don't play video games and don't necessarily understand them to an extent, and it's sort of that blaming the unknown, if you will, because for a lot of people who don't play or get to know video games at all, they see all they see is violent images on the news, and then see violent things that people are doing also on the news, and sort of make that link and decide that this is necessarily bad for people.
Yeah, I've been told by sociologists that study media that the same sort of reaction has occurred throughout history. I mean, when the Gutenberg printing press was first developed, there were people who thought, oh my God, what a horrible thing. Now the common man's going to be able to read. And then, years later you have paperback books, and a lot of people were in uproar. Oh my goodness, not everybody can afford to read these stories, and that's going to cause violence in our society. Or comic books, that's going to cause violence. Or radio, oh my, these radio programs are so violent, it's going to increase violence in society. Or movies, television, and now, of course, video games is the last culprit we blame for violence in our society. By the way, there's not as much violence in Japan, and they all play video games too.
Exactly. In fact, that was one thing I was going to mention as well. How do you feel the Japanese gaming industry has changed? Because it's very Western now. If you look overall, even though both Sony and Nintendo, two of the three major players, are Japanese, a lot of games now are very Western. Even the ones made in Japan are made to target a Western audience. Do you think that Sega may have had something to do with that? Obviously, Sega being more successful in America than Japan, etc.
And in the UK than Japan. Yeah. Yes, I do. I think that has a lot to do with it. And I think it's mentioned in the book. And this was something I didn't realize. I didn't realize that Nakayama, the chairman of the company, was beating up his executives in Japan and saying, "Why can't you market and sell as many products in Japan as the US SOA is, or that the guys in the UK are? Why aren't you able to do this?" And so I think that sort of forced the developers to do more Western appearing games. Although I think in Japan society they still really have a preference for big strategy games and role-playing games, and of course the combat games are still very popular there. But things like FIFA Soccer is wildly popular in Japan now.
Yeah, and when you look at weekly sales figures worldwide, Japan has an absolute craze for handheld gaming. With the top two selling platforms always being the Nintendo 3DS and the Sony PlayStation Vita. When you first sort of looked upon the Game Gear and you heard about the Game Boy, did you think that handheld gaming was also part of a bigger future for the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I first saw Game Gear and saw color games on an LCD screen at a reasonably affordable price, I thought this was going to be an absolute blockbuster, and it actually was. The thing that I've been a little sad over time is I would have thought the handheld game business would have been even bigger in the United States and Western Europe than it has been. And I guess what's happened is the phones have become so capable, although I still, we were doing games where we were trying to build 50 hours of play in them, and now people do Angry Birds for 5 minutes. I don't quite get that. But anyway, I think that's taken the benefit of having a separate handheld game machine away. Phones have really stepped into that spot.
That's where I'm very torn in the world of mobile gaming, because on one hand, I being a big gamer myself, I'm not a big fan of a lot of the mobile oriented games, because I can't really I can't get so much enveloped in a minute and a half session of Flappy Bird or anything. Whereas I like to play what I would consider sort of a proper game on a handheld. So I play a lot of my Pokemon titles on my 3DS and things like that, and Mario Kart, and also, as a side note, I downloaded Sonic the Hedgehog 3D on my 3DS, which I found I didn't realise it was on there until the other day, the original Genesis Sonic the Hedgehog, but in stereoscopic 3D, which was interesting. But yeah, although at the same time, mobile brings games to people who may not necessarily have been able to enjoy them before, and that's where I sort of draw the line. That's where I see the good side of the mobile industry. While it may not cater to the types of games I want to play specifically, and that's majorly because of touch controls. I find them a bit of a nuisance to use. However, people who may not have ever seen themselves as a gamer have been told by people, this is fantastic, you've got to try it out, and may then lead the way into the industry and them getting themselves a dedicated machine. Did you ever think, while you were at Sega, that mobile phones could possibly be the machine to take over?
No, I would have missed this completely. I'll tell you frankly. I mean, if you'd walked in my office and said, "Hey, we're going to form this new company called Zynga, and we're going to do really short games, and we're going to turn them out before they're even done. And that'll be our market research. We'll see if people like them, and if they do, then we'll complete them. But they'll never be big, long games." I would have thought you're crazy. I mean, again, we spent all this time and effort making games that were 50 hours, and if we could, we'd try to reach for 100 hours of play before you could solve or finish the game. And that was the world I lived in. You spent your money in R&D to make a great game, and then you released it, and sometimes you were wrong and it wasn't successful, but you still did your darndest to make it a great game. And the idea of turning things out that are half-baked or that are going to be really short, I just I wouldn't have understood. I still have a hard time understanding it, frankly.
I agree. What are your thoughts on microtransactions in games? This is something that I really dislike that has been added to the industry, to be in the middle of playing a game and it'll come up with essentially a large advert on my screen saying, just pay £1.50 now to get this upgraded armour. And I'm like, well, I've already bought the game. Surely that counts as I should unlock the armour. I unlocked it in a shop with a credit card. Give me the armour. What are your thoughts on microtransactions?
I agree completely with you. That's something else I never would have done. And obviously I would have missed a huge profit generation for these companies. But it just wouldn't have occurred to me as a proper thing to do. But anyway, it's part of the world we live in now. And I still have a 17-year-old here at home who does it all the time and runs up a large bill buying new weapons.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how the game industry sort of made that shift, and I guess it makes sense as a money-making strategy, but at the same time, I think I understand it in what they call free-to-play models. If you get a game for free and there are microtransactions in there, I understand it a little bit more based on the fact that they've spent money on making a game and have given it for free. But I don't want to go out and pay £40 or $60 for a game and then be expected to pay more for, let's say, a costume.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think in a free-to-play game, maybe they give you a couple levels and then they expect you to buy more for additional levels and additional characters and weapons or whatever. That's fine. The one thing I really dislike, though, is games for young kids where they do a microtransaction in it. I think that's just horrible. Because children can't. They're going to want everything, and you've taken the decision making away from the parent, and it's just, I think, improper.
Yeah, I was talking to a few of my friends who are also independent game developers, and I think what leaves sort of a bad taste in my mouth when looking at some of the games, I feel like some games are deliberately targeted at children because they don't know what they're doing and what they're buying. And yeah, recently I think it was Apple had to pay back millions and millions of dollars to parents whose children had spent thousands just clicking buy on everything they see because they don't know they're spending real money. And yeah, I feel like firstly it shouldn't be there. Secondly, I think it's far too easy to access as well. Without even needing to enter a password or anything. And yeah, I feel like that's just one of those money-making strategies that some people have.
Yeah, very, very inappropriate when you're dealing with young kids to do that.
Yeah. One thing that's become quite standard now is downloading titles digitally, and also upcoming now streaming titles, which is very reminiscent of Sega Channel.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think, well, do you believe that was ahead of its time, and had internet service and telephone services been better at the time, that it could have been a little more successful and easier to use?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, clearly, you're number one. It was ahead of its time. I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the U.S. In that period of time, almost every cable box in every city was different than the one in the next city.
Oh, right.
So the engineering job was really difficult to get this to work across the country in many different markets. I remember once I walked into the R&D area, my buddy Joe Miller, and there were all these console boxes. There must have been 50 of them, from different cable systems around the country, and the guys were having to tweak and change the device we put between the cable box and the Genesis, so that you could make it work. And it was a heck of an engineering feat. Now, on the other hand, the idea of paying $15 a month for a selection of video games that changed every month really was a good idea. You know, it did catch on. We had about 250,000 subscribers at one point. And so, you know, we were a joint venture with Time Warner and also with TCI. And, you know, unfortunately, there wasn't enough profit in it at that time to divide among three different partners and have it continue. Plus, I'm not sure you're aware of this, but the guy who ran this division for us passed away right in the middle of it. And that was a huge setback for us. And, you know, that certainly didn't help the situation.
Oh, of course. Oh, that's a real shame, because I feel like that's, again, another one of those things where everyone at Sega was very much thinking ahead and more about the future of the industry as opposed to just the now and what's happening at the time.
Yeah.
And it's another thing that surprises me again when I see all of these innovations that were there. I find it hard to believe that they ever exited the hardware industry. I feel like there was so much there that, you know, had they kept continuing this trend of thinking into the future and coming up with things years ahead of when they actually become mainstream, what could we be looking at now that Sega would be coming up with? I just find it all very interesting.
Yeah, I do too. And like I said, I think there were some decisions that were made, and that if they had gone the other direction, if the correct decision had been made, Sega would still be a powerhouse in the video game world today.
Do you feel like you might ever properly re-enter the video game industry at any point?
Boy, I get asked that, and my team, my former team keeps pressuring me to do that. My Sega buddies all want us to get back together and do something in the video game industry. I've been resisting because I've been so busy using technology to help improve education, both with LeapFrog. I mean, I stepped down as CEO some years ago, but I'm still vice chairman of the board and very deeply involved in the company. I'm also on the board of something called Cambium Learning Group, and there again, we're converting normal curriculum to interactive curriculum and trying to make it more fun and interesting. And so I see this whole area of both making educational content interesting, but also using the technology, as we did in the video game industry even back when I was involved, make it adaptive to the player, so that if you're a great player, we're going to keep making that game harder for you. If you're not such a good player, we're going to make it a little easier so you still enjoy it and can catch up or can compete against somebody else who's at a different level than you are. That kind of technology really needs to be done better in the education world, and so that's what I'm really focused on right now.
I absolutely agree. A lot of the things that I see now, I kind of wish I had while I was growing up. Like Minecraft has become quite a big thing in the industry, and I was actually watching a news article the other day. A lot of schools here in the UK have started using Minecraft in various IT classes to inspire creativity in the same way Lego did.
Yes.
But digitally, and I think it's interesting how video games are they're starting to enter every aspect of life and are actually able to help with nearly everything you can think of.
Sure.
Is Sega what sort of led you to get into this mindset? Is being at Sega what made you think that this could help people, and this is what you'd then want to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of funny. A light bulb went on in my head because when I forgot to finish the story on Pico. When we were doing Pico and we were quite successful, Sega Japan then said to me, "Gee, so you're doing 100 million, but you're not making that much money, and yes, it's a different audience. And by the way, if you just do another football title or a baseball title, you'll sell 100 million. So." And it's a lot easier. It takes too many people to do this education stuff. It's too hard. And the light bulb went on in my head where I thought to myself, a pure entertainment company is going to have a very difficult time doing education correctly because it's too easy to make money in entertainment, frankly. It's hard to do this in education and make money. And so that's why I think being in a separate entity, a company dedicated to education, is the only way to use video game technology to improve education.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's impressive how everyone's had this mindset for a long time. Of course, education needs to be fun. It's the best way to encourage, obviously, kids to learn. Because obviously, looking in a textbook, if a kid doesn't want to learn, it's going to be much more difficult for them to learn. Is there anything particularly? I know there are sort of things you can't talk about, but is there any sort of new ideas that you're currently glossing over? Anything particularly new that hasn't been done before?
Well, I think right now LeapFrog actually has announced these efforts. We're about to launch a new system that is a video game system at LeapFrog, but it's 100% education, and it does connect to your TV. And the idea of it is that all of the games will get you up off the chair or off the couch, and you'll be active while you're engaging in education activities. And some of those activities are helping you learn to read, others are helping you with math, others will help you with science. But you will be involved in physical activity much more so than a Wii, for example, because this will be your whole body that you'll be moving. And again, it's designed for little children. It's not designed for teenagers. It's designed for 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds. And then the other thing that we just announced is, and again, obviously that is video game technology in every aspect of it. And the other thing they just announced is a watch that has a video screen on it and a game on the screen that's on your wrist, and that game also is activated by your physical activity. So again, the game will be telling the child, okay, run 100 feet, stop, get down, do 3 sit-ups, do some push-ups, get up, run again, and you'll be getting points, and your character in the game will be getting stronger and more successful as you're doing this physical activity. So those are a couple new things that we're, again, very much using video game technology in the area of education for young kids.
All right, it sounds like you're certainly enjoying what you're doing now. I think it's very interesting. In fact, the watch thing, I hadn't even thought about that. I hadn't thought about how a watch could be used for educational or even, for the fitness purposes of growing up. I think that's incredibly interesting. Are you still in contact and friends with your old Sega team?
Oh yeah, with quite a few of them. I'm in close contact with Al Nielsen, who's mentioned prominently in the book, with Madeline Canepa Schroeder, who was another head of marketing that we had at Sega in the book, and Diane Fernacier, another head of marketing, Ellen Beth Van Busker, who ran all of our communication programs. And it's interesting, by the way, there's three women, think about that, in senior positions in a video game company in the 90s, not today, in the 90s. There weren't any others than ours at Sega.
Even now,
Even
that's still
now,
a big
I know.
topic of debate, and I'd say that's another thing Sega has on their list of being a little bit ahead of the time, I guess.
Yeah. And then, of course, I'm still in close touch with Joe Miller, who ran R&D for us, and a number of the producers, Ed Annunziata, Mark Latham. There are a number of the producers I've stayed in touch with. And, of course, Shinobu Toyota, who was, while he was from Japan, but living here in the United States, and was really my right arm at Sega. And, it's kind of funny because I think Sega Japan thought he should be their spy on what we did here, and it turned out he was my spy on what they were doing.
How do you feel you were represented in the book? Do you feel it was, obviously because it was, he had a lot of contact with you at the time, do you feel it was all very accurate, everything that was told on, obviously, the Sega side that you were there for?
I think so. I think it was very accurate in terms of the thought processes we went through and the new stuff that we were always trying to do. I think that there were, Blake had to make up conversations because, nobody could relate exactly what the conversation was 20-some years later. And so some of that, occasionally I read it and I say, I don't know if that's exactly what we said or not, but anyway, it's close enough. So generally, I think it was pretty accurate.
How is it, do you think, that it got quite as big as it did? Because obviously the book was announced, and then all of a sudden there's trademarks by Sony for websites for an upcoming movie based on the book and a documentary at the same time. Do you think this all happened because it's sort of the first book of its kind? Because I've looked about and I can't find anything else quite the same like it.
No, I think that's a good point. And remember, when Blake proposed this idea to me, when we first met, he said, "Hey, I want to do a book on the battle between you and Nintendo when you were CEO of Sega of America." And I said, "Gee, Blake, that's really interesting. There's probably 200 people in the world that'll care." And he said, "No, you're wrong. There's a whole generation that grew up with either Sega or Nintendo or both, and they're very interested in this topic." And he turned out to be correct, obviously. And, Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg were and are video game players, and they picked up the feature film rights. Scott Rudin, who's produced Social Network and Moneyball, and last year Captain Phillips, also a guy who played games, decided, hey, I want to produce this as a movie. And of course Sony, the other half of Sony, which makes motion pictures and TV shows, was interested in distributing it. So clearly Blake was right in his initial premise.
I must say, when I first heard that Sony had registered domains for Console Wars movie, I thought that was a bit interesting because obviously they're one of the big players in the current Console Wars, and I was sort of thinking, would they not be a bit biased in that situation, even if it is the other division of Sony? But I'm very much looking forward to it. Do you have an actor in mind that you think could portray you well?
I'm pretty sure whoever I suggest won't get picked. So if I say somebody, that's the kiss of death on that guy ever being me. All I care about is as long as it's somebody that is 20 some years younger than I am today. Because I don't want somebody said, oh, George Clooney ought to play him. Well, no, he's too old now. It needs to be somebody younger than that. So some younger actor, hopefully in his 40s, will play me.
Are you in contact a lot with the film's development at all? Because I'm not sure how it's going to be done. Do you know if it's going to be using real recorded footage at all from things like E3 in certain parts, or is it all going to be staged? Do you know much about that?
Oh, well, first of all, the documentary has pretty well been shot. So the documentary is in final editing, and obviously in the documentary, it really is me in it, and it really is Al Nielsen, and it really is Shinobu Toyota and Paul Rio and other guys who were at Sega and gals who were at Sega. And so that's been shot, and I've seen a little bit of it, and there's quite a bit of course, game footage in it, and a lot of shots from what E3 looked like back then versus what E3 looks like today. So there's some of that in there. Now, the feature film, they're still writing the script. They're taking the book and converting that to a movie script. And I haven't seen any of that yet, so I don't really know the answer to your question. I would imagine they're gonna have to amp up some things they'll make more fictional. I would imagine in the feature film.
You answered my next question as to how the documentary was coming along. Most of the interviews in the documentary, were they the same interviews necessarily that were conducted with Blake for the writing of the book? Were they sort of filmed at the same time, or were they redone afterwards?
No, they were done afterwards, and so the documentary movie will be somewhat different from the book. You'll get more exposure to some of the Sega people and to the Nintendo people. They went up and they did film Howard Lincoln up in Seattle. They filmed Olaf Olafsson, who lives in New York today. And so you'll see us as we look today talking about what went on 20-some years ago.
I'm very much looking forward to it, I must say. Do you know how it's being distributed? Is that theaters, or is that TV, or?
My understanding, and initially, by the way, I think it was going to be TV, but now my understanding is that it's going to be a theatrical release first. And it'll be sometime around the end of this year, is my understanding.
Right. I assume they are planning to release that internationally.
Yes. Yes.
Just checking that's not.
By the way, the book hasn't been released in the UK yet, has it?
No.
It's August 15th, I think, is the release date for console wars in the UK.
Yeah.
How did you get a copy of it?
I had to import it through Amazon.com.
Amazon, of course. Yes. Yes.
I saw a few reviews of it, and I thought, that's out already? And I went on to Amazon.co.uk immediately and saw it release in August, and I couldn't wait that long. So I paid a lot extra to get it as soon as I could. When I finished the book, I then went online and bought the audiobook, which is actually currently available over here. Mind you, that's an MP3 though. So, but yeah, which I also found very interesting. The only thing I did find odd in the audiobook is hearing Mario pronounced Mario in an American accent. Usually I hear it pronounced Mario. American, but
there's a few other names that are pronounced incorrectly in the audio, but what the heck?
Yeah, why not? And it gave me a good extra 20 or so hours entertainment, but
it's quite long, isn't it?
Yeah. Was there anything in the book that you didn't know about? Let's say, like on Nintendo's side of things.
Oh yes. I was so immersed in my own world at Sega. I didn't know how they were actually thinking up in Nintendo. I knew they disagreed with a lot of the stuff we were doing, but it was very interesting to me to read the actual discussions that went on up in at Nintendo. So for me, that was I enjoyed that. That was a part of, I didn't expect that I would enjoy reading about Nintendo, but I did. I really enjoyed that part of the book.
What were your thoughts on the announcement of Donkey Kong Country? Because that was quite a big release for the Super Nintendo, especially as mentioned in the book that initially it was thought that it was a Nintendo 64 game until he was told, no, it's a Super Nintendo game, and it's interesting what Rare managed to do with that. What was Sega's reaction when that was announced?
Well, very frankly, that scared us. We thought that was going to be huge, and it was going to be, look great and be great, and that was going to be, a big blow to us. So that we were very worried about that. And it was, it turned out it obviously was successful, but it wasn't as different or as successful as we had feared it would be.
In terms of the creation of Sonic, I haven't managed to actually see the initial sketches. What do you think would have happened had the initial Sonic with the fangs and the guitar? What do you think the reception would have been had that released in the US?
I think my team, Al in particular and Madeline, really got it right. I think that they were correct in taming Sonic a bit from the character that had originally been proposed. The fangs had to go, and there was more aggressiveness in his face than he ended up with, and the spikes were even sharper than he ended up with. And his girlfriend was a really bad idea. That was a typical, how the Japanese guys love to do games with busty women with short skirts or short shorts on or something. And that's basically who Madonna was. And so it was right to get rid of her in the game. So I think we got it right, and I think they were wrong. I think if we had been forced to release it the way it was, I don't think it would have been as big a hit as it turned out to be.
I agree. I can see why it may have been a success in Japan. I can see how that could have been successful, but I certainly wouldn't have bought Sonic the Hedgehog if that was the idea behind the character, especially at a young age, And also, the name Madonna did make me laugh when I heard that.
It was kind of funny.
I thought of all names they could have, of course they went with Madonna.
Right.
Was there anything else that may not have been mentioned in the book that SOJ came to you with that you just had to say no, something that just wouldn't have worked?
Oh yeah, there were a lot of different things that occurred over. There was one game. You're not going to find this really hard to believe. There was one game that had swastikas in it.
Really?
On the yeah. And, they just didn't have a sensibility as to what was appropriate for the Western world or not. So there was stuff like that we had to get rid of.
That would have been quite controversial.
Yes, it would have been.
It would be now, let alone then.
Yeah.
Because in fact, I can't remember when it was now. Must be over 5 years ago now. A game called Call of Duty World at War came out, and it was set during the Second World War, and its zombie mode. When it made its way to Europe, it had to have all the swastikas removed because it came out in the US that way, and it was deemed offensive by a lot of people, even in the 2000s. I can't imagine what it would have been like.
Well, what's even more bizarre, at least if it's a World War II game, you kind of expect to see swastikas. This was a game that was not a World War II game, and it has guys with swastikas on. So it was just crazy.
Interestingly enough, I believe I was actually only hearing about this today. There was a game in similar vein, I guess, released on the Super Famicom, and it made its way to the Super Nintendo in America, but heavily altered, had various different imagery removed that they felt could be offensive. However, the part of the game at the end where you meet Adolf Hitler and beat him in a battle was left in the game. And there were some graphic details of his death, and for some reason that was left in the North American version of the game, but things like the swastikas were removed. An odd process on Nintendo's behalf. But yeah, what do you think about the level of control Nintendo had over third parties? Because a limit of 5 games is quite a few. That's not a lot of games per year, and obviously then restricting the fact that they had to be exclusive to Nintendo.
Right.
What did you feel about all these requirements and rules that Nintendo set out?
Well, of course, it made it very, very difficult for us to get third-party support from third-party publishers, and so it annoyed me because of that. I mean, on the other hand, the third parties hated it because not only did they limit the number of games they could do, but Nintendo alone decided whether it was a good game or not a good game, and controlled how much production you got as a third party. So you might have thought you'd made the greatest football game in the world, and they'd let you sell 100,000, but the marketplace might have wanted 400,000, and you know, it was just too much control by Nintendo, and it offended so many different people, so many companies, and eventually offended retailers as well. And I mean, you know the story. You read the book. I mean, the reason that Electronic Arts was so anxious to work on Genesis was, of course, they figured they could reverse engineer our hardware and thus do games without paying us anything, which was somewhat controversial, and we had to reach an agreement with them. But they hated the idea of Nintendo's control so much, they refused to publish on Nintendo for many years. Anyway, so in the end, though, it all worked out to our advantage because people's resentment against Nintendo was so strong. Here we were more willing to work with you and make life a little bit easier for you, and yes, we still got our licensing fee on every cartridge, but we weren't like Nintendo.
In fact, that's one big thing I was going to bring up. When I was reading the part in the book where EA had reverse engineered the Genesis, I couldn't help but think, was that even legal? Were they even... I mean, I can't see anyone getting away with that nowadays. If someone reverse engineered the PlayStation 4 and started releasing games completely without Sony's permission, was there any legal way of actually doing that?
The problem is, in my understanding of the legal situation was that if you reverse engineered it in a so-called clean room, where the people who worked on the reverse engineering weren't influenced by anything else, that there was a chance you would be allowed to do what an EA wanted to do. Now, we Sega certainly would have sued, and it would have been a big legal case, and it would have cost both companies a lot of money. And that was why we reached the settlement that we did, where we gave them a price they could, or a royalty scheme that they could afford, and we certainly benefited from by having Electronic Arts publish on our platform. But I think the answer to your question is, back then at least, there was some legal hope that they could have been able to do this.
I did find it very interesting. I sort of tried looking up afterwards and realised there were also similar instances with the Super Nintendo and the NES, people trying to reverse engineer the hardware, and I just couldn't quite wrap my head around how anyone was going to be able to get away with that, especially in the way that I can't remember the name of the company now. Someone did it with the NES, I believe it was. Tengen. They were the ones, yeah. And obviously then Nintendo immediately said to retailers, well, it's either them or us, and obviously Nintendo was making them so much money at the time, it was kind of a no-brainer. Where was I going to... pardon me. Was there any work, I understand, obviously, you left in 1996, so this was a few years prior. When they released the Saturn, did they already begin working on its follow-up, the Dreamcast, or...?
It happened shortly after the release of the Saturn, but they did start working on the Dreamcast right after it was released. But, you know, the development cycle for these hardware systems back then was a couple of years. It took a while to do it.
Do you think the Sega Saturn would have had a very different lifespan had it released on time, like you'd planned to on a Saturn Day, as opposed to being forced to release it upon E3?
Well, it certainly would have helped the situation. The other thing was we really needed, as I said earlier, to have more and better games at the time of launch. And if we had done that, and if we'd done a proper launch, I think there's a good chance it could have been successful. You know, the shame of it was we had these great relationships with retailers that we built up over 6 years, and by having to release early, we could only include 2 or 3 retailers. So everybody else was furious with us. And that's not a good thing to do, to get all of your retailers upset with you and them not wanting to support you any longer. And so I'm not sure that came across as clearly as I feel it in the book. But I mean, I suffered the phone calls from so many friends that I had in retail America, furious with us over just releasing with Toys R Us and ED, or whatever the other one was we released with.
What I'll finish up with the case of Nintendo, there's been a lot of people sort of saying that Nintendo is, let's say, doomed and things like that, because their sales have been not particularly fantastic of the Wii U, especially in comparison to the Wii, which skyrocketed. Do you think that Nintendo might also be on their way to becoming a third-party publisher, or do you think they're going to stick around in the console business a lot longer?
Well, I really don't know, to tell you the truth, but they have a way of sticking with their strategy, and their strategy clearly is they control their hardware and they do the best games on that hardware of anyone. And when you've got, there's some pretty bright people there, so I wouldn't be surprised to see another platform come out from Nintendo that will be a better hardware platform, and that they will continue on this strategy. In fact, I would be surprised if they gave up the hardware business and became a third-party publisher only.
All right, I agree with that. In fact, one side note, do you own any Nintendo consoles yourself?
I've always had a very difficult time owning Nintendo, but I did get a Wii U. I got the original Wii. I don't have a Wii U. And we used to, when my boys were younger, we would play the baseball games on it, and the bowling, and the tennis, and that sort of thing with it. And that's about all we ever used it for.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. And
my pleasure. It's very late for you, I know. So
yeah, it's just hit 2 a.m.
Oh my goodness, I forgot. I'm so sorry to keep you up that late.
It's absolutely fine.
Well, I enjoyed
happy
talking
that
with you,
take the
Phil.
time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm sure a lot of people watching will be with me when I say I'm very much looking forward to watching the documentary and hearing more about it, and wishing you the best in everything you move on to do.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and good luck to you too. And we didn't talk about you and what you're doing now, and I'd love to hear that. So if you could send me a note on it, I'd love to know.
Yeah. In fact, I'll add something short in now. In September, I'm off to university in London to study musical theatre. As a side thing, as my day job at the moment, I'm a chef. And in my spare time, I've gotten into developing video games.
Oh, congratulations!
And so I like to sort of do a bit of everything, but yeah, things are going well at the moment. And the website
Good for you.
Going up on www.remasteredmedia.co.uk. I started that when, I don't know, I was 14, maybe 15.
Wow.
A while ago. And yeah, it's because I've always had this fascination with video games, to the point where I'm pretty sure I read about them and research them more than I actually play them.
You should reach out to Blake and talk with him as well, because you have a lot in common. By the way, he has a musical appearing off Broadway starting in a couple of weeks.
Oh, really?
That he wrote,
Oh,
yeah.
wow. I was actually meant to talk to him earlier today.
Great.
Unfortunately, we had to reschedule, but yeah, I'm absolutely looking forward to that. And,
terrific.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, congratulations. All right.
Thank you very much. See you later.